Okay, greetings everyone. Hello, my name is Patricia Gagnon, and I'm the Chief Experience Officer and one of the co-founders of Intellispark. I am joining you today from Arlington, Virginia, where it is a blustery day and winter is knocking at our door. It's in the 30s, but it feels like the 20s. So we're here today to talk about resiliency matters, and it does matter. And it is a core piece of the Intellispark program. Intellispark reaches 180,000 students in more than 250 schools in 16 states, with a platform that helps schools know the name, face, and story of each child, and helps educators to easily collaborate as an integrated team to better meet students' individual support needs. Our work at Intellispark helps all educators to be on the same page with deep insights about what students need, what has been in place to support them, and what proven strategies can help them. Today's subject, Resiliency Matters, Measure It, Nurture It, and Help Your Students Thrive, is the topic that we know you are all committed to, as we feel this when we work with you as Intellispark partners. You are doing such great work to support your students so tirelessly. As you know, resiliency is at the heart of our ScholarCentric program, an evidence-based program that helps students improve their outcomes by measuring their resiliency, and then teaching them resiliency. Today, we will share practical strategies that you can use to incorporate resiliency into your existing teaching and counseling practices, leading to better outcomes for your students. Our hope is that today will be the start of an ongoing discussion that Scott and I will have with you this school year. We'd like to reconvene again in January, March, and May to further explore key topics on your mind. So if we aren't able to get to everything on your mind today about resiliency, please do send your questions to us so that we can plan our next discussion for the first half of January and truly begin to develop a community of practice around nurturing resiliency. I'm pleased to welcome Boston University professor, Dr. Scott Solberg, who is a key advisor to the Intellispark team and whose research underpins ScholarCentric. Scott is a professor in the Department of Counseling and Applied Human Development at Boston University's Wheelock College of Education and Human Development. He works across the country and internationally on the design, implementation, and evaluation of effective career development programs and services, especially for high-need youth populations. He has studied resiliency for more than a decade, demonstrating that for many students, resiliency is the most important factor leading to academic success or failure. Some of you may know Dr. Solberg for his book, Making School Relevant with Individualized Learning Plans, helping students create their own career and life goals. So I'm going to move right now into our agenda for today. We'll be having this discussion, Scott and I, and Scott will be speaking to the following elements of resiliency. First, what makes the 6 resiliency skills? Then we'll move into, some of you have asked in your pre-webinar questions around research. So we'll be using theory and research to identify a theory of positive youth development, and Scott will share some research there. Next, we'll move into steps from data to intervention. You've got this information. I know many of you are saying, I've got this. What do I do now? Where do I start? Especially if I see a lot of red. We'll talk about intervention support for Tier 1 and Tier 2, and then finally talk about trauma-informed supports for Tier 3. While we can't see or hear you, we do encourage you to engage through the chat and Q&A so we can do our best to get topics to you that you'd find helpful. I also want to point out that during the discussion, I will aim to place some links in the chat box with helpful resources. And we will also put these in a follow-up email as well. Please note that this is being recorded and we will make it available online in case you'd like to share it with a colleague or review some of what Dr. Solberg has to share. Be on the lookout for 2 emails for us in the coming days, one with a certificate of attendance and the other with a link to the recording. Both emails will include information on how you can get Intellispark Pro with ScholarCentric for your school or district, or just reach out to us with more questions. So without further ado, I'm pleased to welcome Scott and to kick us off with the first question. Since this discussion may be new to some of you, we're going to start with some fundamentals about resiliency. Welcome, Scott. I'm sorry for the long introduction. Lot to say here today.
Yeah.
And really, really appreciate your joining us from also probably very blustery Boston. So Scott.
Thank you. Yeah, it's blustery, but on the inside, they found the heating system and boy, did they crank it. So now it's a balmy Florida day here inside the building. So yeah.
Time to learn the layering process for winter, because you never know what you're dressing for. I think we can all do that for sure. So Scott, thank you again. And I think we've got a lot of very interested people eager to hear, certainly the research, but also the latest that you've seen in your work. So first, can you just start by sharing how you define resiliency and explain why it is so fundamental to students' academic and long-term outcomes?
Yeah, thank you. And also just want to echo that we know there's a lot of people on the call that have been to previous sessions that are very familiar with the work, and others are new. And we're also trying to help educate how to explain it to some of your colleagues who may not be as familiar with the assessment tools and the intervention. So, so some of this you'll see some very advanced, you'll see some very beginner. We're trying to cover across a lot of needs as we go through. So yeah, I think the issue of resiliency is very specific in relation to what happens when an individual is in a stressful situation, dealing with perhaps some trauma, some disruption in their lives and things like that. And I'll show you kind of the elements of that in just a moment. But the way we're defining the resiliency space is around these 6 fundamental skill sets. And they're fundamental because these are all malleable. So the valuing education, do I see post-secondary education as something I want to aspire to? And it doesn't have to be post-secondary as a 4-year, it could be a 2-year, it could be, some future beyond high school, if you will. And we find that that's an important piece. Having that sense of hope for one's future is an important component to all of this. We call it academic confidence, but we also call it self-efficacy, right? So it's the confidence in my ability to perform some of these core academic areas is a really important component to all of this. And we know that relates to persistence, it relates to approaching challenging tasks, and it relates to the idea that even when I don't do well on it, it actually motivates me to try harder on the next time. So the academic self-efficacy is a very important mechanism in all of this. Connectedness is a word we use. It's really perceived availability of social support. And that comes from our families. It comes from our educators. It comes from our peers. And we know that that's also a really core component. We've got lots of great research showing the health benefits of having people that we can depend on. Not that they're always in our lives, but when we need them, they're available. And that's the key component there. Stress management is always something we all know as adults. It's always a lifelong issue. The ability to manage and not get overwhelmed so that it's at a point that it starts to be debilitating in terms of our motivation. And then we have the health and well-being, which is another important thing to keep in mind. And we'll look at some elements where we really do, especially now as we talk about mental health issues and the needs that our youth have. The health and well-being is really raising up as a core issue. And then motivation. Why am I here? What's the point, right? Why am I in school? Why am I focusing on certain pathways and thinking about my future? What's the point of that? And do I find it meaningful? And do I find it relevant? So that's our framing. That's how we think about resiliency in that phase. But let's talk about now just kind of what resiliency is compared to other things we know about. We're all familiar with social emotional learning. If you want to go to slide 3, we're familiar with, or slide 4, I'm sorry. We're also familiar with the developmental assets. So these are very common themes, and it's like, well, what's the difference? And one of the differences that we all need good social emotional learning skills, right? We need to get along with people. We need to have empathy. We've got to have some complex communication, responsibility. All those key elements are important. And what that does is it elevates, it helps support helping our life outcomes improve for everyone. The developmental assets are also similar in that way, but although the developmental assets talk about both the internal components as well as external, so some things in our environment that are needed to help support optimal growth, optimal development. When we get to resiliency, it's a very specific component that activates when the individual is experiencing high stress, as we said, disruption. It could be some trauma, and what it does is it steps in to help the individual continue moving through successfully, or getting their academic work done, managing their relationships as best they can during those times of challenge. And so when you look at, as we think about this particular graph, then some key elements of resiliency is that we're talking about malleability, right? Things that we can change. We're talking about designing interventions, and in this case, we're going to be designing the context to help support that development. We know it's a buffering effect, so that when the individual increases with the stress, we know that these resiliency skills jump in and start to support that individual in that. And we also know that it's related to future career readiness, the future readiness. And so the 21st century skills and employability skills that we talk about are all connected here as well, because they're the basic interpersonal qualities and the way we manage ourselves that employers are looking for at the end of the day. And we're adding in here trauma informed, and we'll come back to that at the end when we talk about some intervention. But the idea is that we need to recognize that our youth that are challenged, and we talked about the high need group, they've gone through a lot. They've got, whether it's racism, whether it's challenges in learning, there's just so many different things. We've all gone through COVID. We've all gone through a sense of where we're going as a world with the wars and everything. There's a lot of ways in which our youth today, and us as adults, are really feeling pressure, and really through vicarious trauma or direct experiences where we're being challenged. So there was that piece. And then I think we're going to go into a little bit more on that, right?
Yeah, and Scott, a question that has arisen is, students who are poor learners have had years of academic failure.
Mm-hmm.
How do we help these students who are working below grade level?
Yeah, no, exactly. That's exactly who this work was designed around. So I'm going to show you some data here in a moment, and I'm going to say over and over, it starts with the relationship. So you as an educator, creating an authentic and genuine empathy, all of the stuff with that individual helps a lot. In fact, it's very powerful, as well as having activities that enable the individual to explore their talent, not their academic skills, their talent, and the ways in which that talent can be applied within the world of work, helps give them a sense of hope and purpose. So that combination of a relational base combined with structured activities that really help them see that there's a future possibility beyond in their future that they can aspire into is a huge piece. You want to move on to the next one then, and we'll. Okay, so let's talk about some data, because some people, we've been having some questions about, is there any more recent data on this that we can look at? This is one way of carving out the ways in which the caring and encouraging adult has an important impact. This impact in this particular study was looking at the whole career search self-efficacy. So are they able to explore their talent? Are they able to see in the world of work where they can apply that talent, right? And can they begin setting some goals? And then you see goal capacity there as a secondary piece. And then what vocational identity is it's actually an open-ended qualitative piece to say, hey, have you thought about your talent? Have you explored it? Have you thought about where you might want to go in your future? And have you started being planful? Have you started taking steps to either further explore or to begin pursuing those activities? And so this idea of identity starts to step in, and we'll be swinging back to that a lot through this as well. So what we're finding is the caring and encouraging adult is huge in this, right? It has a direct effect on supporting the individual to believe in themselves. That's the exploring part of who they are. And it also supports them in aspiring to goals that go beyond themselves. So what are those next set of goals that they might want to think about?
And Scott, if I could interject
Yep.
here, I know one of the things that you've said is that, again, it can feel overwhelming when you have, when you feel like students have so far to go. But what really struck me was when you said you can't underestimate the power of this. And I think this is what this diagram shows, is the power of that connection with the caring adult is the one of the first places you want to start in order to take the student on this journey. And
We
so,
do. And I mean, we've got some great research coming out of the European Union, specifically OECD, that's looked at all the longitudinal research studies. And those studies are US studies, they're Britain, Australia, all over the world. And one very powerful finding they've got is that when youth have a chance to have conversations about their future with a caring and encouraging adult, they're in middle and high school, they're actually able to showcase the income increase that occurs as young adults. So there's something magic that's happening that when we have adults who are encouraging and caring, and what it really does, and when you think about goal capacity, what Anthony Mann, who's the lead author on this report, talks about is that you're building their capacity to aspire. You're helping them believe that there's something out there in the future that they actually can attain. And this is a very critical issue when we start talking about youth of color and youth that have not had role models in some of these key areas. So it's a really, again, we can't underestimate the power of just taking that time and getting to know the individuals, the youth that we're with. And when youth feel that there's that adult who cares about them and is really willing to trust them and believe in them, the last thing they want to do is let you down. They're motivated to want to do better in school because the last thing they want is for you to be disappointed in their efforts. So that's kind of the power that comes in with that. I do want to go back to the resiliency. Leave the slide. You can stay here. It's fine. I just wanted to say that the other thing about that makes resiliency happen is Ann Maston has a really good piece, and I think you put the link in there. And what she's talking about is the ordinary magic, that there's something powerful that's going on within this concept of resiliency. So really encourage you to look at her original piece as well, because that's certainly what's formed our ideas about resiliency. So in this particular piece, what we're looking at now is this idea that the resiliency skills develop, as we were saying, through the exposure to these caring, encouraging opportunities, so the social connections, plus what we call quality learning experiences, which honestly, what we measure it as is what is happening around nationally. Most of your states, nearly all of your states, are involved in some kind of individualized career plans. You've got some kind of mandate, or you're being strongly encouraged to use those. And that's what we use. We said, are you getting access to these exploration activities where you're seeing who you are as a person? You're beginning to explore how the talent you have applies in the world of work. And are you beginning to look at the post-secondary pathways? It could be, I can go directly to work and get certifications. I can do 2-year, I can do 4-year, I can do military. So a broad range in terms of those pathways. And so if we think of that as context development, right, we're building the context, what we're seeing is this adaptability, this resiliency explodes. And that's what you're seeing, all of those key areas of self-efficacy, the goal capacity, which means, am I setting goals? Am I looking for opportunities to pursue those goals? We're talking about motivation. So this idea of, again, do I find my school relevant and meaningful? All of that improves, and then that goes right into positive youth development, which we're measuring in this case as I'm managing my health and stress. I'm ready to start thinking about my future. You know, this is why we get stories in some of our rural areas that when youth have had these contextual influences and these kinds of things, all of a sudden teenage pregnancy rates go down in their community because the young women are seeing a future that they want. And as a result, they're starting to behave differently. They're starting to look at relationships differently. So these are very powerful things we're talking about. And we create that context right in a school setting, an after-school program, any kind of youth-serving organizations can all be participating in that. Let me see. And then I also wanted just to say that we also have good longitudinal data from the United States, from our colleagues at WestEd, that has showcased that when you're involved in the caring, encouraging adults that are facilitating these individualized career plans, students actually become more engaged in that post-secondary pathway. They're choosing a more rigorous academic schedule. They're getting their FAFSA forms completed. They're finishing those applications, and they're actually entering into the post-secondary pathways that they've selected. So this idea of the power that this has in allowing the individual to start shaping their future is really what we're seeing in so many different places, in so many different areas. Ooh, said a lot there.
Are there any questions so far? I know that and I think you'll be talking about this a little bit later, Scott, but there's a question of, well, who is the person who leads that discussion with the student about the career piece? Is it the counselor? Is it the classroom teacher? Does it have to be an external mentor? Where does that begin?
Yeah. And I want to just go back to Scott Gerson's question. We're going to talk about interventions a little bit, and I want to come back to your question again and give you some more specifics in terms of that. But yeah, I think what the research says, which I'm very excited about, so I'm a big fan of educator engagement. What it says is that when educators and employers have these caring, encouraging conversations, when they're facilitating these activities, that's where the impact happens. So not saying school counselors aren't important. What I'm saying is to have that effect show up in longitudinal studies, that just an educator, just an employer coming in and just engaging with students about their future, about their talent, facilitating, as I said, some of these activities, that's where the power is. And that allows us, I think, as school counselors, which is where my work is in training, is that we need a team sport. We need to be designing what's going to happen, but then we need our educators to be the facilitators of those activities. And that's really been taking off nationally. We're seeing a lot of engagement around a whole school approach to doing this. And there's lots of ways we can push that in. We can call it social emotional learning. We can call it mental health. We can call it lots of different things. We think of it as resiliency. And so it just depends on the framing for your particular context to kind of think about that.
Mm-hmm.
So just wanted to show you kind of, again, we talked about identity being at the core of this, and we kind of forget that. We're helping our middle school and high school students gain a sense that they have purpose, right? There's something in the world that they want to have an impact on. We're focusing on their finding a sense of hope that they can actually pursue and accomplish those opportunities. And we're looking at agency. We're looking at them becoming more proactive in approaching these opportunities. And in this work, we're finding that they activate in finding volunteer activities and finding some of the work-based learning opportunities that they need. So that's the kind of the centerpiece, is we're helping the individual become the driver, if you will, of that success. These are some of the theories. We won't go into them today, but we can certainly come back to these in other sessions. But I wanted to show you where my head is. And we've got some references after this where if you really want to follow up and see. But this is how I think about these things. And it does impact how we do the intervention, because I'm not worried about where you get started. And we've got all this great data on our students. And it's like, wow, they've got so many things to work on. Start somewhere. They're all interconnected. And our developmental systems theory really helps us understand that. Our developmental contextualism says, yes, focus on designing a healthy context, because that's what's going to produce a healthy individual, right? And at the end of the day, it's more than the grades. It's more than the academic. It's really about health. It's about well-being. It's about thriving. And that's where SEN's work and capability theory becomes an important element to this whole thing. You can skip through that. They'll get those. You'll get all those.
You had the research. You will be able to access subsequently.
Yeah, and I'm only giving you those because I know some of you need that or you enjoy that, and so I just want to make sure it's there. But we'll continue on with the conversation.
Okay. Now, Scott, I've heard you refer to measures of resiliency as an early warning indicator.
Yeah.
What do you mean by that? And how should schools think about measuring resiliency alongside traditional early measures such as attendance, behavior, and grades, which they're, at the forefront of their mind?
Yeah, I think what we have found, and this has also been shown, and other colleagues have also picked this up, is that by the time their attendance patterns are falling off, right, that means there's been an issue going on, and now it's showing up. When all of a sudden their grades go down, their emotional stuff goes down. So those, all of the ABC kind of models is really at a point where it's now a new problem. It's a significant issue. What we're looking at is, can we predict that if we don't do something now, this individual's on a trajectory towards those behaviors, right? They're going to be more likely to stop attending, or they're going to reduce their attendance. They're going to reduce their engagement in school, right? And so that's what we have found. And that's, again, we have other colleagues that have also looked at this as well, that have also, verified the idea that these psychological components are the precursors to what later becomes the early warning ABC kind of model. And we've done our own research on this, and we've got a big publication on it where we actually show that the students who had these warning indicators through the high school experience, so we track them from leaving middle school through high school, they were more likely then to fall off that high school track. So they were getting more failing grades, attendance was down, there were more behavior reports. So we do have some support for that as well in our own work, and that's how we kind of built out the this as you're seeing all these different colors was based on what were those warning indicators, right? What was the threshold when that became an issue as we go along. And I know you've got the purple here as well that we want to talk about, which is that academic risk index. And so let me just, and we can honestly, we'll start this conversation, and if people come back and say, hey, we need more detail on it, we can go into all the details. I'd love to show you, I'd love to talk about research so we can talk more about that. Not as a threat, I'm just saying as an opportunity if we want to do that. But what this academic risk index is we took out of all of our 6 indicators, each of those indicators have little subscales attached, right? So education has both thinking about school now as well as future education. Confidence has 3 different components to it. You've got social confidence, you've got the actual courses that I'm taking, there's some test taking, self-efficacy. Connections has 3 areas, the peers, the family, and educators. So each of these areas have different sub areas, right? They have what we call subscales. When we took a look at which of those subscales, right, are most predictive of whether or not an individual will be successful, or in this case, is more at risk for not doing well in school, we came out with about 5 specific subscales, and it was across all of these areas. So there, and those particular 5 subscales, when you add those up, as the individual is scoring lower on those, it gave us a higher percentage of probability that this person is in danger, right? That they're in danger of failing out of school. And so it actually got up to an 85% predictability when they were on the extreme end of things. So this is what this academic risk index is doing, is it's saying, look, across these specific 5 areas, how is that person looking? And that's why you can have a person who can look like across all 6 areas they're not doing well, but in those 5 subscale areas, they may be okay, or they may not be. That may be where the challenges are. How did that go? Was that okay, or did I just create more confusion?
No, I think that was helpful. I'll see. Looks like there's a question arising in the box. But I do want to ask a question that came through the other day from one of our attendees, and that was, okay, so what if a student has an academic risk index and yet they end up doing fine? How do we explain to our staff that just because they have an academic risk index score, it doesn't mean they're absolutely going to fail,
right?
But the student also isn't hunky-dory. So how do we help our colleagues understand that it is predictive, but it also means that there's other stuff there going on?
We hear so many stories, and we've been hearing this for years, where the principal will call us and say, you're telling us our valedictorian, is at risk, this measure, what are you really measuring? And we always say, go talk to the student. And every time they come back with we didn't know, right? We didn't know. We didn't know about the divorce. We didn't know about the homelessness. We didn't know about the suicidality, the hospitalization. I've had presentations where principals come up and thank me because they had no idea that their star student was just hospitalized the week before, right? Or the month before the survey. There's stuff going on here. We know that now. COVID showed it. COVID has showed us that our youth are so at risk for so many challenges right now. And we've got all the stuff that's going on around the opioid use and everything. This is a challenging time. And so they're not going to show that when they're in class. So this becomes a way of seeing, is there something underneath that we want to look at? Are they really thriving? They may not be failing, but are they thriving? Are they reaching up to be able to be the true potential that's there? So anything we can do to uncover and understand and connect with them in these spaces, I think, is truly powerful, because our youth are sitting there knowing it's going on, or maybe they don't. When I was first started with this, the well-being measure, It's got 5 different subscales. And I was walking around the room and saw this young woman, and they were elevated beyond anything. And I said, wow, it looks like you might want to chat with someone. And she just looked at me, she goes, yeah, I think so. How is she supposed to know that her health issues, her distress is worse than others? She doesn't know that. She just knows she's having a hard time. So this is the part of what we're talking about as well, is that the youth really don't know where they are within all this. They just know they're trying to get by. So when you get the individual scores for that student to see where they're at, that's also a very exciting moment where they can begin to think through what might be happening and all that. But this gives us as educators a chance to join in and just start asking questions, and also start designing a context in a tier 1 to try to help everybody start to address some of these challenges. Because if they don't have them now, they will at some point, right? This is what life is about. You move in and out of challenge. And so we just want to be able to provide a context where they have the resiliency to move through those challenges.
So Scott, now that we have ScholarCentric embedded within Intellispark Pro, how do you see that helping us to accelerate our ability to take action for students?
Yeah, thank you. It's a great opportunity from the standpoint that you have right here a summative assessment, right? So we talk about formative and summative. The summative assessment is how am I doing in my overall? So we would do this once a year, twice a year if we're doing a pre-post. What we're doing in Intellispark Pro is we've identified students as having some challenges. Let's say it's around confidence. Now we can push in some formative assessment tools, just really tiny, short 3 or 4 items, just to say, hey, how are we doing? What's our temperature gauge on that? We know we've been connecting with you. You've been doing some great stuff. Are we seeing that confidence starting to emerge? It also allows us to communicate across. We've got some complex kids, especially at tier 3, when we're needing to really create a system of supports, right? We got to coordinate. And so what I think what the Intellispark does, not only would allow us to help see how they're doing in real time, are we seeing some progress in these issues? And when something happens positive, when something happens that we're wondering about, we have a community that's working with that student in different ways. And we now have a way to communicate that is fantastic. And it's like a just-in-time kind of way of making sure everyone's on the same page.
And what I'm going to do is just kind of remind folks, I'm going to show you just 4 slides with quick product images just to show you where that comes alive. So again, if you're looking at a student hub page, as a reminder, just below the quick check indicators would be where you can see their most recent resiliency scores, as well as the sub skills. And Amanda, I saw your question. We will send you those sub skills so that you can review them. Amanda Etienne had a question. But then also you can see, we also have the ability now to see right on the students hub page the trends, like how have their resiliency scores been doing over time. Here we have those formative assessment pieces. So how are they doing on those quick checks throughout the year? And again, how are they trending over the course of the year with these little, monthly or quarterly checks? And the beauty is that it's not just somebody who has a list of spreadsheets that can look at this. Anybody who has access to this student, a teacher who has a student on their roster, can see this information and know how their kids are doing beneath the surface. And as Scott said, you can see student self-reported answers to our quick check surveys, like, hey, what's your greatest strength? What's your biggest challenge? Or any of your surveys that you want to push out and ask about the student. You can see if they're receiving any praise or if no one's giving that student praise. And you can see if flags have been raised. Again, you can see by a certain class or a certain group of kids if there is an area where a higher percentage are in the red on some of these areas. So again, a lot of ways to look at different groups of kids. And then, just kind of as a reminder, I know some of you are really focused on getting the resiliency results, but the next thing is that story that Scott was saying in between that pre-assessment and that post-assessment. What's happening? Is there something that happened in the hallway between a couple of kids? Is there something that happened last night that we can just put in a note from our mobile or from our iPad or whatever device we use, tag the kids, and we can push it out if we want to everybody who supports those kids really easily. We know that right now, one of the hardest parts about collaboration in schools is it's like, takes a lot of time to figure out who are the 7 people who support this student and that student. It's a lot easier now to get that information out really quickly and get people on the same page. And then the last thing, and then we'll come back to some specific strategies from Scott. But as a reminder, we know that you're not always going to have, your whole team of educators at the school who are going into Intellispark daily. But with the this weekly digest, every staff member can find out for the kids they should see what happened last week, who had a flag raised, what actions or supports were put in place, who's receiving praise and why. So it'll keep us on the same page without even having to go in. Of course, you can click on the name and find out more about what's happening for that student, but our goal is to make it really easy for you to take the next step on those resiliency pieces. And I see there's a question, does the platform allow for communication between educators and students and educators and parents? At this time, the platform is really most heavily about the educators behaving as a team. The only communication to a student is if you send the student a high five, if you assign the student an action, or if you're asking a student to complete a survey. And the only communication to a parent at this time is that they can be copied on that high five sent to a student. So the parent is seeing what good news or great attention a student is receiving at school. Okay, so I'm going to keep us moving, and I'll keep trying to address these questions as we go. So, Scott, I know that joining this webinar today, we have educators who, as I said before, they've used ScholarCentric, some for a while, and some who are just seeing results for the first time. And a frequent comment that we hear, especially those for getting results for the first time, is, wow, we're looking at this data and trying to figure out where to start and what to do with the data. And it's a little overwhelming, trying to determine where to start at the district, building, and classroom level. Where do you recommend we start in responding to the data?
Yeah, so I thought we could kind of do like a little walkthrough, kind of step by step as a thought on this. So, and we did all this. I mean, we did this in schools when we were designing it. So this is stuff that we've practiced and found it to be effective. And there's lots of other ways I think schools can use this as they figure it out. But the general idea is when we're looking at the data, it can be overwhelming, especially if we're dealing in, this was designed in Milwaukee in a very high need school. So it was designed specifically for those youth that are challenged and are experiencing a lot of challenges as they go through. So this first one is, let's just look at the data to get a sense of the general areas, right? If you look across the 6 resiliency skills, what across your particular school seem to be the top ones, right? What's the percentage going on around some of these areas? And from there, we can begin thinking about what kind of tier 1 supports might be needed. We've already talked about the power of relationships and connections. And so, that's one of the ones that I think we want to be looking at. We also want to be looking at how well they're doing in terms of the belief in their future. Do they feel a sense of hope? Do they see something going on there? But we want to, and in all of those, then we can begin as a group starting to think about what kinds of things we could push in. We've had schools have a weekly luncheon activity that involves talking about some of these topics. Certainly the classroom activities can happen in there as well. And we've got, we've had interventions that can work with that. But the idea is to think as a community, where are we lacking? Could be that today, stress is such a huge issue. So is it really about stress as a whole and trying to dig down into that? So that's the idea, is just to kind of get that general sense first of where we're at and what we might be able to, as a community, start to think about. And also, don't think that it all has to happen in school. Are there some community-based organizations we can bring in to work with our students or to connect with and supporting our educators around some of these topics? So again, it's not as though we have all the solutions, but these can become the questions that we can begin building a bigger collaborative strategy to work with. The next one is to look at those purple groups, right? Who's in that purple? Who are they? This is where our mental health team really needs to start taking that part over, because we're really interested in having just a conversation. What's happening? What's going on? And so it needs to have our social workers, our school counselors, our psychologists. It's a team sport, and we need to kind of divide and conquer that list of students so we can begin just exploring what might be happening, what's going on with them as things are going. And out of that, we can hopefully build out some more of the tier 3 kinds of supports that we might need. Go ahead and go to the next slide. I think what I have. Yeah. And then going back to all of that crazy red, yellow, and green data, right? We can also start circling those students who might be a good candidate for doing some breakout groups, right? Maybe there's a common need. Maybe we've got a lot of grief going on, or we've got a lot of just health, right? They're not managing diet. They're frustrated. They're upset. Maybe there's some things we can do around those kinds of things. We found action theater, by the way, was a great intervention for for those students that have trouble on the behavioral side of things. But there's other things we can be bringing in to say, okay, how can we work with different groups and needs? And so the tier 2 supports and interventions then become something exciting to consider in that space. And then where Intellispark comes in to coordinate these interventions and supports, conducting those, as we said, the formative mental health and resiliency assessments can go a long way then of working with the students and just doing some check-ins to see, as we're doing some intervention work, as we're exposing them to some tier 1 and tier 2 and tier 3 types of supports, are we starting to see some change? Are we seeing them coming, improving? And if not, then we can reassess what we might need to add in to that delivery and to that whole process.
Scott, a couple other questions that have arisen. Do you suggest schools share the data with parents in real time? Is it recommended? I would ask you that same question regarding students. And I know different partners of ours take different approaches. What's your thought on sharing with parents or students?
So we have, right, there's an individualized report for the students that they can be shared with. And so, yes, I'm a big fan of incorporating that into part of that conversation, letting students see their results and reflecting on those. It can be done in small groups. It can be done one-on-one, depending on the kind of tiered supports that you're providing. But the idea of having a conversation about development, about change, what can I do to improve that? What's going on with that? It has to be done in an authentic way. So the teachers, the educators, whoever's working with them, has to share their own story. So if you're the school counselor leading it, make sure that teacher is there and that teacher is providing as much kind of information about themselves in addressing these issues throughout their life as the students are, because they need that relational base. And it happens, interestingly, through that process. It gets back to Scott's original question. How do you help that student who's never really performed well and they're coming into high school with a history of failure? Well, when that teacher starts acting in an authentic way and sharing something about themselves, it's very powerful. The student is stuck with, why is this person sharing? It must mean that I must be worth something if they're willing to share something about themselves like this. And it's in that moment that students have an idea that maybe this is different. Maybe this relationship and this experience is going to be is different than what I've had in the past. And it's in that moment we can start helping them change and start to believe in themselves in different ways. So this is a very powerful thing, to share the data, giving them their individual reports and talking with them. I have my favorite experiences is bringing parents into this conversation. We've done it in more of a general terms, where we've had just a conversation about the 6 resiliency skills and how they can participate in supporting them. But I've had on more than one occasion sitting down with the child and the families. They all come in, we've got food, we've got a whole time, and the student has the data and they share it with their parents, and there's conversations going on. We're talking through the concepts, and it can be a great bonding experience, but it's also a way for us as a school, as the family and the student, to think about how we can begin thinking about how to change some of these directions. So I'm a fan of that. It depends on, every context is different, and your relationships with families are all different, but I do like the ability to do that. So again, you're not sharing them the reports with all the color stuff and all that stuff, you're sharing the individual kind of bar graph results. So the student can decide for themselves, is this an issue I want to work on? And the family can look over the shoulder and do the same as well.
And I think especially because there is the reality that this is malleable. We're meant to identify this so that we can move the needle. And so that's where it should be, a hopeful thing that actually, look, this is just a starting point and we're going to iterate here. Okay, I'm going to move on. I think another common question that arises, Scott, is how do you teach resiliency? People coming in today's call, we're definitely looking for some practical strategies. We will also share, there was a request to a link for action theater that was just referenced. So we will send that along. But I know people are looking for practical strategies for seamlessly bringing this to life in their schools. And they're wondering, is it a specific new class? Is it a concept that gets woven into core subject? How do you speak to that?
Yeah, and I also want to just say, somebody asked if the assessment was strengths-based. Exactly. That's exactly what it is. It's all about assets. It's a positive, it's very much a positive, not looking at deficits in any way. So to answer the question, how do we teach resiliency? I don't think we teach resiliency. I think we create the conditions for resiliency to emerge, okay? If it were a lecture that I could give, boy, we wouldn't have any problems, right? And if I were a better lecturer, I'm sure my daughter would be understanding why I want her to do all these different things in her life. But she kind of has to discover it on her own. So this idea in a school setting is a perfect place for us to design these learning environments. And these are some of the core research evidence-based conditions that facilitate the building of this, the emergence of this resiliency. Written exercises really helps the student articulate some sense of goal, some sense of purpose. There's something about the writing that's really important. Individualized interpretations and feedback is really key. It's something that really helps with helping the individual understand. That's what the bar graphs provide when we give the individual reports. Seeing how it connects to the world of work, right? Youth need to see a future and how the skills they're learning can be applied out in the world of work. The vicarious opportunities, this is why we need employers in there, and we need educators talking about their own experience, their role models. They're talking about the things that they've done, and those become the modeling for them to think about their own life course and the different possibilities they have. The support networks, social capital, right? Building on those. Mastery experience is getting in and practicing it, trying it out. And this is why I'm really excited about our career and technical education and the whole idea of connected learning. So they're learning something in a classroom and then they're going out in the world and they're practicing it. That is an awesome way of building a healthy and success identity. Verbal persuasion is our ability to empathize and then encourage, right? It's really that encouraging quality that comes with that caring adult. And then anxiety management, again, really huge, learning how to do some relaxation, not be stressed at approaching these challenging situations, but being able to manage that. And then again, the connections between the youth, adults, and peers has a magic quality in really producing a sense of motivation and engagement. So these are things that are all part of whether it's self-efficacy research that's been done, career development research, or in DC and Ryan's case with self-determination theory. These have all been evidence-based supports to really help optimize the conditions for a positive youth development. And so this is where I would say this is where we need to focus, right? As we do a learning activity, are we incorporating some of these key conditions? And then we can move to the next, I think, on there as well. There we go. So I've got some areas here to think about. For the tier 1 and 2, the ScholarCentric curriculum, which is what we created when we designed the assessment tool, was really designed, and this goes back to Scott's original question, how do we create an authentic conversation with youth around these resiliency skills in a way that allows the student to realize that as adults, we've been challenged or continue to work on these ourselves, right? That we can connect to those. And it's in that moment that the youth sees that this adult is being real and authentic, that it really challenges their stereotype of what a teacher is. I was amazed, and I was always shocked at how students would come through and go, wow, I didn't realize this teacher was someone I could actually talk with, or that they could actually be a mentor, right? So there's something powerful about getting off the academic conversation and getting into these conversations about life and about the conditions or the skill sets we need to move through life in an effective way. Certainly social emotional learning. We got lots of curriculum coming out of the Castle crew, and not that's theirs, but they've been giving you access to all kinds of SEL kinds of things. I mentioned the individualized career plans. These are all activities that facilitate identity development. It helps the individual see themselves as talented. It starts to help them explore where that talent might apply, and then starting to look at some plans on that. And then one that you would have to pay for, the other ones are more, some of the ones, I know some of the social emotional learning ones are off the shelf you pay for, but there's a lot out there that we've got access to. I've given you some at the bottom here. But the Wayfinder, I've studied it. They've asked me to review their materials. I've not ever been paid by them. I've just looked at it. But I've become a fan after a middle school group of educators got up and gave a presentation on how they use it. And I'm convinced that they've got something here that you might want to look at. And I think you can use some of your Perkins dollars to pay for it, because this would certainly be, once they use the word durable skills, those are the employability skills that employers need. And so it is focusing on those qualities, as I said, the talent that the youth have, and building that talent. And so what makes it a nice and exciting activity is that you can say, I've got 15 minutes and I need it on this topic, and they will provide you with a lesson that's ready to go. So, so really, really something to look at and consider as well. I've got a bunch of other free kind of access lessons. We should put in the optimizing your learning is one of our favorite ones around what are the conditions I need to be able to maximize my learning, and helping you think through that and kind of build a plan on that, which was something we designed through the COVID when one of my children was exposed to the lesson. And so we designed something to really build that up. And it's been something that's been very popular throughout the COVID times. Okay.
Okay. Now, tier 3.
Yeah, so I want to come back to the trauma-informed part, because this is something that when I saw this presentation, and I think we've got a link for it for you on that, blown away at not only the neuroscience involved, the brain science around trauma, but also loving this metaphor of a bridge to self-sufficiency. This was a group that was working with homeless adults, and they were connecting the idea of your career development, your education, financial literacy, health and well-being, stability, right? And all of those components, I think, connect with what's going on when we talk about youth that are being challenged. So really love it. But the thing that I really am drawn to is an idea that when we have youth that have experienced some trauma, right? They've been, and it could be direct, it could be lots of different ways the trauma comes in, that it impacts their ability to plan for their future, right? It has a strong, it has such a strong impact on their flexibility, emotional flexibility. It impacts their ability to think forward, as we just described, the critical thinking, so many different elements. And so there's something here that we have to look at. And I think we have to understand better and have more patience for those individuals, that it's not going to be a simple, I gave you an activity, how come you didn't just immediately take to it? We may need to work differently in a more compassionate way, with lots of supports. And the only way we can really do that is getting to know that individual, learning about them in some way. And so the combination of having professional counseling plus an educator who's willing to witness and be a part of that person's life and believe in them, I think can go a long ways in supporting that individual. Also know that everything we're teaching them through these opportunities, these lessons and activities and encouragement, we found often that the students that have been in a kind of a trauma, they kind of ignore it the first year. They don't really give any indication they're listening. They're not being disruptive, but they're not really listening. They're kind of just hanging out. And the next year they come back, and all that information we were trying to teach them is now being integrated. They're applying it. They're so excited about it. So with youth, it's an interesting process, right? We have to be focusing on what we're supporting and designing the context, creating the conversations. In time, the youth are definitely going to benefit through it. But with a trauma-informed perspective, we have to just slow down a little bit. We have to really think through what additional resources we might need for those individuals.
Mm-hmm. And, Scott, one of the things that first of all, that point really resonates, because I have a young child who, You may not think she's listening, but she's hearing it all and she's processing it in her own time. And I just think that's just the reality. Children and young people hear so much, but they just have to stew in it a little bit, and they'll talk about it when they're ready or when they've been able to figure it out or ask questions about it. Um, one of the things that I really love is when I see educators who have figured something out or learned something that has worked for a student, putting it in Intellispark and pushing it out to the team and saying, hey, either I learned this really can set the child off, or this is something that can really help them thrive. You might want to try it. And I love when people do that. And I think, especially where there has been trauma, it can be small things that can really make an enormous difference. So we are at 5 minutes before the top of the hour, and as Scott predicted, it was a bit of a fire hose, and even at that, we weren't able to leave a lot of extra time. But as Scott has said, we would like to reconvene in January, and really it'll probably be more open-ended discussion to give you more time for that. But before closing, I just want to ask Scott, is there anything else that you want to say before we open the floor for maybe just one or two additional questions?
No, I think I'm good.
Okay. So there are just a couple of other questions I see here. And again, feel free to put comments in the chat or other questions in the Q&A. How effective, a question we have, how effective is ScholarCentric for K through 5? So we start at grade 3. We have an elementary version, 3 to 5, and then the middle high school version for grade 6 through 12. But I had seen some questions come through, Scott, before this webinar about, how do you address resiliency in really young students?
Yeah. Yeah, and we definitely have a measure that we worked with some elementary school teachers in Las Vegas and really brought it down to that 3rd grade level, and the concepts may actually fit, and certainly they fit conversationally at the younger grades as you look at that. I think what's important when we look at the preschool to 3rd grade is we really are building identity. And when we're talking about our youth from historically underrepresented backgrounds, we really need role models. And we really need to be thinking about who are they seeing? What are the images they're seeing about successful people throughout the world in an education context? So they know there are people who look like them and are about them that are successful, and they can be that person. Really important. They love to hear the stories about how individuals made it through. And we've got some colleagues here at BU that are doing research on that social influence. And it's not that the student person's successful, it's the story about their journey that is so exciting for young children to have. So I think we really need to be thinking about the design again of that context for them to see role models, for them to believe in the possibilities and what needs to happen. And then what's interesting is, how do I go somewhere I want to go? Well, you've got to do well in school, right? I mean, it becomes a natural reflection point to say, oh, that's why I'm learning how to read, right? That's the process I'm doing. And so we need those academic interventions and supports as we're going along as we go through. But what we're providing is a motivated student, an engaged student who wants to learn those because they realize it's part of their pathway to some kind of path or some kind of future that they're invested in. So yeah, that all starts early. It's not about making choices. It's not about career choice. So we're not doing that at all. What we're doing is we're helping them see a happy and exciting future, a future they want to participate in. And to do that, then what are the skills that it takes to be able to do that? So that's the whole process as we go on. So no, we're not using I think there's ways we can incorporate those into the kinds of activities we're doing in the school as well at the earlier ages. But yes, most of our work has really been focusing on that little later elementary and on up.
Gotcha. Yes. Yes. And I will say that within Intellispark, we have some light formative assessments that can be done just to really get a conversation going with those really young kids, like even 1, 2, and even 3 to 5. But they can be done in a more quick fashion. So at this point, I know we are almost at the top of the hour, and I just want to say, number one, Thank you all for joining us. Great engaged crowd today. I love the questions. Scott, thank you so much for the breadth and depth of your expertise. I know we all continue to learn so much from you, and just love to hear the new research that's coming out as well. Because we know this is just so critical. This work is so critical, and love the connection between what students are doing today, how it ties to that long-term plan and long-term success. So thank you. And I appreciate the opportunity to reconvene this group again in January. I would invite you all to send us additional questions. If there are specific things we didn't get to today, which would be understandable, then we invite you to send those questions my way, patricia.gagnon@intellispark.com. And I hope that you will be able to join us, and we can tailor the discussion. And certainly be on the watch in your email for your certificate of attendance, a link to the recording, information about Intellispark Pro and ScholarCentric if you're not using it. And certainly I will put some of these links in if you didn't have a chance to capture them. But I know the research is very important to many of you, and there's so much to dive into. So thank you again. I hope you have a wonderful afternoon, and may it be a wonderful December. Thank you.
All right. Thank you, everyone.